Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Recently, I've gotten a lot of questions regarding some of the videos that I've done on different types of weed growth. And it's become apparent to me that a lot of people have questions regarding what the actual weed is. So I'm going to do a couple of videos detailing the differences between weeds, and then we're going to break it down into emergent weeds and submergent weeds. And today we're going to talk about emergent weeds. And these specifically are going to be more of the emergent weeds that I think you need to pay attention to that hold bass on a very regular basis. So if you can identify these types of weeds and know when to go and fish them, it will increase your odds of being successful on the water. So the first one that I want to talk about, and no matter where you go around the country, you're going to have several of these species. So you may not have them all, but I guarantee you will have at least half of these in your region, no matter where you live. And if you don't, you're probably got some type of weed form that's very similar. So the first one we're going to start off with is just cattails. Cattails are very standard, thick stalk plants, that grow way up out of the water. They provide extremely good habitat for bass and other species, as well as just the insects and birds and just wildlife that utilizes them, which means there's going to be a lot of food that brings the fish to those areas. I really like to fish cattails early in the year, specifically during the cold water months. And the reason for that is because the cattail is a very thick growing plant, meaning they grow in clusters, real thick clusters, and they are thicker stalked, wider leafed plants, which grab a lot of heat. The base of them are generally a darkish brown color. They just hold heat better than most other forms of emergent plant growth. And the fish seem to really gravitate to them during the pre-spawn period up until the spawn. At that point, you can catch fish year-round out of cattails. But in my opinion, a lot of times the fish will gravitate away from them unless they have really good water depth. If you've got good water depth on them, for sure the fish will still utilize cattails. Moving from cattails, we're going to go to round reeds, or what some people call buggy whips. They're those long strands, tubular strands that just looks like a whip if you were to pull it out. Down in Florida, they grow to be like 6-7 feet tall. Up north here, if they're 3 or 4 feet out of the water, that's pretty much, as big as they get. We call them bulrushes up north, but they're all the same thing. They grow much more spread apart. You can find them. You can get groups where they are really tight, but you still have a lot of room to swim between them, unlike cattails, which can grow so thick that they form a wall. The round reeds are really good indicators of hard bottom. Generally, they will grow in sand or gravel, and because of that, they become really good places for fish to spawn. And not just bass, but the bluegill love to spawn in them too. So a lot of times what I'll see is the bass will utilize the cattails in the pre-spawn period and the spawn period, and then gravitate more to the round reeds for the second part of the year, up until when the water temperatures really start dropping again. You get that cold water and the fish will move back to the cattails from the round reeds, because the round reeds are more spread out, right? They don't have the ability to hold the heat, which isn't ideal for fish if that's what they're looking for, but it makes them still very good areas that hold fish, because you do get a lot of bait fish that come in, and all the species like the fact that they are in a harder bottom area. So round reeds are really good to fish. If you do find good thick clumps of them, and by thick I mean where the stalks are 4 inches apart, you'll up your chances of catching fish out of those. But during the spawning months, you may find one round reed sticking out of the water, and there'll be a fish holding on it. So you don't want to just write those off, but they definitely hold fish in a lot of places. I really like fishing round reeds. So those are kind of two plants, emergent plants that I will put kind of in their own category. Then we'll move over to like lily pads, right, guys? Lily pads, no matter where you go in the country, you've got various types of them. You can have those giant Sylvania pads, I think they're called. You can have the little silver dollar pads. I'll include arrowheads in this. They really are just kind of scattered throughout the country, and no matter where you go, you will always find some fish, some bass, some bait fish, some panfish utilizing pad fields. In some instances, that may be the primary thing to fish. In other places, they may not utilize them as heavy, but it still is going to hold a few fish. You know, I've done videos on what to look for when fishing giant pad fields, but you know, in this case, they are a plant life that really works well. For me, the number one time period for me to really key in on pad fields is during the spawn period. Not even to the point where you have a thick pad field. I like fishing the areas where the fish are going to spawn, and a lot of times they will spawn right on the tubes, the root systems of the pads. And when they're spawning, a lot of times you don't even have pads up to the surface. You may have a scattered one here and there, but it's not the, you know, giant thick pad field that will be there a month later, you know, after the summer starts. So I really like fishing pad fields during the spawn, and I also like to fish them when the water temps are at their peak, because the thick pad fields will will create a lot of shade. It'll sometimes have cooler water, and if you can find some areas that may have a little deeper water or have a ditch or a little a spring of some form, those areas can be tremendously good in giant pad fields if you can figure out those little sweet spots. With respect to arrowheads, arrowheads are, you know, grow in like little clumps. And the one thing I want to point out about arrowheads again is generally they grow on a harder bottom. And if you find an arrowhead clump, that is a really good place to look in the spring, because there will usually be fish spawning on them. And if they're not, they do still provide really good ambush points. If you've got a big pad field or big weed flat, and then you have one little patch, it could be that big, of arrowheads that are sticking out of the water. It's almost like, you know, having a dock post. The fish can butt right up against it. Utilize that as a place to ambush prey and catch fish. So the next group of weeds are more of the thicker growing shoreline grasses, I guess is what I would call them. The two I'm going to talk about that are really good are what I call Kissimmee grass. I think that's what most people call it. It looks like a hayfield growing in the water is literally what it looks like. It's kind of that brownish color. It's more down in like the southeast region. Or in like Texas has some if you fish Sam Rayburn and the lakes down there, but most of the Florida lakes all have Kissimmee grass that grows around the edges of the lake. A lot of times it'll grow in like a band that's 30 feet wide, but it just, for whatever depth it grows in, that's where it's going to be on that lake. And they can be really, really good to fish. Again, the fish will utilize it year-round. They'll utilize it to spawn. They'll utilize it in the summer to ambush prey and eat bluegill that are spawning in it. And, you know, in the fall, you get shad that move in there. Shad will spawn in it during the shad spawn. Just a really good place to fish. It can be pretty overwhelming to fish, though, when you have an entire lake that's covered in hay grass like that. So you do want to look for key things, again, like any of these, you know, other weeds I'm talking about. You're looking for little points that stick out, little holes in them, areas that current might butt up against it, high percentage areas to break down these vast Kissimmee grass fields, these big hay fields. Once you move up north from like the Florida region, a lot of that Kissimmee grass turns more into like what I would consider water willow. Water willow, like Lake Murray is a great lake for water willow. You know, it grows from the shoreline out to say 3 feet, somewhere in that region, depending on what the lake has. But again, it's a real thick growing grass, provides really good ambush, and it acts the same way. Fish use it the same way they use the Kissimmee grass in other parts of the country. They'll spawn in it. They'll use it to ambush bluegill spawn in it, shad spawn in it. So you can see how important it is to holding fish, and it holds fish year round. The last group of emergent weeds that I'll talk about, and they're not, I guess, truly emergent, but they're more floating weeds, is when you start talking about like your hyacinth. you know, that again, guys, is a great place to look. Anywhere you have a matted up vegetation form, hyacinth or cut up weeds or just whatever floating trash there is, if there's more than a foot of water underneath it, there will be fish that utilize that to get out of the sunlight and to create ambush spots. So you start getting into your heavy punching gear setup. So, you know, hyacinth is one of my favorite things to fish. If you get super thick, it's really difficult to punch through it, but it's still a blast to fish with heavy gear, and the fish love using it. And again, they'll use it almost year round. They generally won't spawn under it because there's no sunlight penetration, but they'll set up around spawning areas where they're using it as a pre-spawn spot and a post-spawn spot to recuperate before and after the spawn. They'll use it the rest of the year as well as more ambush points and to get out of the sunlight. So guys, I hope this was helpful. You know, I think by showing you kind of visually what each of these weeds look like, it will help you kind of determine what you have on your lake if you're unfamiliar with it. But if you do see these weeds in the lake, these are very much high percentage places to fish. If you're fishing for largemouth bass, they truly will use these in every lake across the country throughout the year. So I hope it was helpful, guys. If it was, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, more tips and tricks coming out tomorrow.